Jean-Francois Duclerc was born in Guadeloupe, France, to Jean Duclerc. His life growing up was uneventful enough to have not left any records, so we will skip on to his adulthood. As an adult, he seemed to gravitate towards the military, and he was hired as a privateer for the French army. For those who don't know, a privateer was a private citizen who was hired to serve in the military without actually enlisting. They were hired and served under the privateer conditions set forth by the government. Privateering was beneficial to both the government and the individual under contract. For the government, it meant that more revenue could be directed toward the war effort, since hiring someone was far cheaper than paying for your own soldiers and supplies. For the privateer, it was a good deal because they were paid well and weren't required to be on their best behavior, as an enlisted man might be, which, unfortunately, led many a privateer to gain a taste for piracy, while the government turned a blind eye. Duclerc began his career as a privateer for the French army as the captain of a fireship. He so impressed the powers that be that he was eventually made captain of a brigade of ships. He was so impressive, in fact, that the French Navy made the decision to put him in charge of a special operation in which he led 6 ships and 1,200 men to Rio de Janeiro in a surprise attack. The men made a long and treacherous voyage across the sea. The time passed slowly and dragged on for the men in the ship. The voyage took almost 3 months to complete, during which time they were preparing themselves mentally and physically for the battle. When they finally arrived at the end of August, they disembarked, ready to offer a surprise attack to the Brazilian city. However, their excitement soon turned to dread as it became apparent and obvious that someone had tipped off the Brazilians. Duclerc and his army of officers were met with Brazilian forces that far outnumbered their own. The option was simple: surrender or fight. The chosen option, which some would call valiant and others call foolish, was to fight. And the predictable result was imminent defeat. Duclerc's army fought bravely and gave it their all. They pulled out all the stops, as one does when their odds are against them. However, in the end, Duclerc's army fought in vain. They were quickly defeated. 400 men were killed, and 700 were taken as Brazilian prisoners, including Duclerc himself. The Crown soon learned of the failure, and a rescue mission was planned, which would involve far larger troops than were sent before, and presumably a greater degree of secrecy and security surrounding the new plan. In the meantime, in spite of his failure to defeat the Brazilian forces, the decision was made to award Duclerc Knight of the Order of St. Louis. This award was a dynastic order of chivalry, which was founded on April 5, 1693 by King Louis XIV, but named after King Louis X. It was a decoration for the most exceptional of officers, and it was especially notable because it was the first honor which could be bestowed upon non-nobles. This was the forerunner to the Legion of Honor. Meanwhile, As the French army was making rescue plans, Duclerc sat in his cell in Brazil and sat and sat. He sat in his cell for 6 months, in fact, not knowing whether a rescue mission was being planned or not. One night, as he lay on his cot in his cell asleep, he was awoken by sounds of footsteps in the dark. He held his breath, listening, and trying in vain to get his eyes to adjust in the dark, so that he could see. Then he heard the creak of his cell door opening and more footsteps. Was this the rescue mission? Duclerc reached for a candle and clumsily managed to light it. What he saw immediately was a group of men wearing masks. We don't know exactly what transpired in that cell that night, but whatever it was, Duclerc was found murdered the next day. Who did it was a mystery. The Brazilian government would be the first to have fingers pointed at them. But does it make any sense to be so stealthy about it? Why the masks or the middle of the night visit? Everyone knew who he was, after all. They had lived through the attack. Why not a public execution? There seems no need for secrecy. Another question to ask is, why only him? Why not kill everyone involved in the attack? The Brazilian army didn't seem to have had a motive to have killed him in such a covert way when he was already in jail for 6 months. Did the other player in this story do it? It does seem a little suspicious that he was awarded such a high honor after he was annihilated in battle. But there doesn't seem to be anything attached to this particular honor that would be worthy of such a secretive assault. Or an assault of any kind, for that matter. If he was such a hero, why kill him? It would seem that there is one option, and only one option, left. He had crossed the wrong person as a privateer, behaving as a pirate. It would seem as though he attacked someone's ship, sailed off with the goods, and disappeared. The person attacked would not have been able to find him until Duclerc was awarded the Order of St. Louis, and it was made public what had happened to him. After this point, the offended person would have sailed to Brazil and executed him in secret, then returned home again. Although I think this is the best explanation, it is still highly speculative, and there isn't much information on this case. In the late 17th century, some idiot terrorized London. His modus operandi, however, was different than you might expect if you heard about other unidentified people in London waiting in the shadows for unexpected victims. This man would hide himself in the shadows at night and wait patiently for long periods of time for an unsuspecting victim to walk by. And he knew exactly who he was waiting for. It was always the same. It never varied. It was always an unsuspecting woman walking by herself at night. When our suspect would see her pass by on her way to wherever she was going, he would slip silently out of his hiding place in the dark and silently follow her, gaining ground and closing the distance between them. When he was finally upon his unsuspecting victim, he would move quickly. He would yell, "Spanko!" forcefully spank her buttocks, and then quickly disappear into the night, giggling. This pattern would continue time and time again on many, many women. The only variation seemed to be that sometimes the assault would commence with his bare hand, and other times it would be done with the branch he had cut from a tree somewhere. These attacks were so violent that oftentimes he left his victims suffering terrible wounds afterwards. Needless to say, the police were flooded with reports. With the heavy outcry, officers were stationed in the dimly lit areas of the city where Whipping Tom liked to hang out, in hopes of somehow catching this fool. Alas, it was not to be. Nothing came from the efforts, and the attacks continued. The seeming inability to catch the culprit gave rise to a great public outcry against the effectiveness of the police force, as well as rumors that Whipping Tom might be some sort of supernatural entity, given how easily he slipped back into the night and disappeared without a trace. Women who needed to walk alone at night now saw a need for extra protection, which they had not needed to carry before. Some carried penknives, others sharp bodkins. Still others carried with them a good pair of scissors. No matter what was carried, it was sharp. Some of the men in the city saw the ineffectiveness of the police in catching this guy and started vigilante groups in order to try to catch him themselves. They went into the areas where Whipping Tom liked to operate and dressed in women's clothing, hoping to dupe the attacker and to arrest him for themselves. But Whipping Tom was not to be fooled, and the attacks went on just as they had before. In late 1681, an unnamed haberdasher and his assistant were taken into custody to be tried for the crime. But no record of any kind exists of the trial, the outcome, or even their names. We have no idea who did this, and we will probably never know. This seems to have been a bit of a short-lived trend at the time. A publication from the same year, 1681, says, "The generation of that Whipping Tom, that about 9 years since, proved such an enemy to the milk wenches' bums." This makes implication that this had been a problem in 1672 as well. An attacker who operated 31 years after these events would have the same modus operandi as the attacker spoken of in this episode, and he operated between October 10th and December 1st, 1712. He attacked about 70 women in the same manner and with the same force. A man by the name of Thomas Wallace was eventually arrested and charged with the crimes after making a full confession. Who was the unidentified Whipping Tom? We will never know the answer.